The moment that changed everything. Michael Thompson's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the quiet streets of Brookridge. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the road ahead. Michael, a 45-year-old white man with short-cropped graying hair and piercing blue eyes, was a familiar figure in this town, one he had called home his entire life. The town was predominantly white, peaceful, and to an outsider, it might have appeared as though the community was a harmonious, close-knit place. But Michael had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving. He had lived here all his life, but the day he and his late wife, Sarah, adopted their daughter, Zoe, everything changed. Zoe, with her dark brown skin and lively eyes, was the light of their lives. From the moment they brought her home as a baby, Michael and Sarah knew their lives would never be the same. But after Sarah's sudden passing 2 years ago, raising Zoe as a single father had come with its own set of challenges, especially in a town where Zoe's blackness was a glaring difference in a sea of white faces. Michael did everything he could to support Zoe. He'd read all the books about transracial adoption, sought out cultural programs, and even enrolled her in a weekly dance class in the nearby city, where she could connect with other kids who looked like her. But despite all his efforts, he couldn't always protect her from the hurtful realities of being a black girl in a predominantly white community. And now, as he drove towards Westfield High School, the school Zoe attended, his heart was racing. The call had come from Principal Harrison earlier that afternoon. "Mr. Thompson, there's been an incident with Zoe. We need you to come to the school immediately," Harrison had said. His voice was tight, urgent, and left no room for Michael to ask questions. He hadn't needed to. Michael's gut already told him this wasn't just a regular school problem. Something deeper was at play, something that gnawed at the fears he carried ever since Zoe started showing signs of distress a few months ago. For weeks, Michael had noticed the change in Zoe. His once bright, outgoing daughter had become increasingly withdrawn, her laughter silenced by a heaviness she wouldn't explain. When he asked her what was wrong, she brushed it off, saying everything was fine, insisting it was just school stress. Michael had wanted to believe her, but the worry gnawed at him. There were things Zoe faced in school that he, as her white father, couldn't fully understand, no matter how hard he tried. He knew kids could be cruel, and that the isolation of being the only black girl in her grade was weighing on her. Pulling into the school parking lot, Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath before stepping out of the car and walking briskly toward the main entrance. The school secretary looked up from her desk as he approached, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "Principal Harrison told me to direct you to the second-floor bathroom." Her voice was hushed, almost as though she was afraid of what she was saying. "Thank you," Michael muttered, his throat dry. His feet moved on their own as he made his way up the stairs 2 at a time. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each worse than the last. The word incident echoed in his head. When he reached the second floor, the corridor was empty, but faint sobs reached his ears. They were coming from the girls' bathroom. His heart twisted, and without hesitation, he pushed open the door. The sight before him made his breath catch in his throat. Zoe was sitting on the cold bathroom floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her body shaking as sobs racked through her. Her beautiful curly hair was disheveled, and her cheeks were stained with tears. But what really made Michael's stomach lurch was the bright red mark blossoming on her cheek. By her side crouched the school counselor, Miss Martinez, speaking softly, but Zoe was too far gone in her pain to respond. Michael crossed the room in 2 quick strides. "Zoe." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough for her to look up at him. The moment their eyes met, fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Dad," she choked out, her voice ragged and full of sorrow. Michael knelt beside her, gently pulling her into his arms. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here," he murmured, his voice shaking. He held her tightly, his mind racing with questions, but he couldn't bring himself to ask them. Not yet. He just wanted to comfort her, to take her pain away, though he had no idea what had caused it. After a long moment, he turned to Miss Martinez. "What happened?" His voice was low but firm. Miss Martinez looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "Zoe, she was attacked by another student, Mr. Thompson." Michael felt as if someone had punched him in the gut. "Attacked? What do you mean?" he asked, though he could already see the answer in the red mark on Zoe's face. Before Miss Martinez could reply, Zoe's voice, shaky and small, interrupted. "It was Ethan, Dad. Ethan Miller." Michael knew Ethan. He was in Zoe's grade, a boy she had mentioned in passing. But why? "What did he do, Zoe?" Michael asked, his voice barely controlled, trying to keep his anger from overwhelming him. Zoe took a deep breath, her body trembling. "He's been saying things, awful things, for weeks now. I tried to ignore him, Dad. I really did. I didn't want to cause any trouble. But today, he pushed me. Hard. I fell against the lockers." The tears came harder now, and Michael's heart broke as he listened to his daughter's words. How had he not seen this? How had his beautiful, strong daughter been enduring this torment without telling him? "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly, stroking her hair. Zoe's voice was barely audible. "I didn't want to worry you. I thought I could handle it. But today, it was too much." Michael felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had failed her, failed to protect her from the cruelty of the world, from the racism he knew she would face. But this was worse than he had imagined. He took a deep breath, turning his attention to Miss Martinez once more. "Where is this boy now?" Miss Martinez hesitated. "He's in the principal's office. We've contacted his parents." "That's it." Michael's voice was laced with disbelief. "My daughter was assaulted. This isn't just some schoolyard scuffle. This is a hate crime." Miss Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "The school will investigate, Mr. Thompson. But these situations can be complicated." Michael's jaw clenched. "Complicated," he repeated, his voice rising. "My daughter was assaulted because of her race, and you're telling me it's complicated." "Dad, please," Zoe whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "I just want to go home." Michael's heart broke again. He wanted to take her home, away from all of this, but he knew he couldn't let this go. Not this time. He couldn't let this be brushed under the rug, couldn't let Zoe think for one moment that this was okay. Taking a deep breath, Michael looked at his daughter, then back at Miss Martinez. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug. I'm calling the police." Miss Martinez's eyes widened in alarm, but Michael didn't care. This was bigger than Zoe or Ethan. This was about protecting his daughter and ensuring no other child would have to endure what she had. As he dialed 911, Michael felt a surge of determination. This was only the beginning. He would fight for Zoe, for justice, and for the future she deserved. Whatever it took. Confronting the system. The air outside Westfield High School was thick with tension as Michael sat on the curb, his phone pressed to his ear, waiting for the dispatcher to connect him to the local police. He could still hear Zoe's sobs from inside the bathroom, and each one twisted his gut tighter. How had it come to this? How had his little girl, his Zoe, been dragged into a world of hate and violence because of something as senseless as the color of her skin? 911. "What's your emergency?" The calm, robotic voice of the dispatcher broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the moment. Michael steadied his voice, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm at Westfield High School," he said, his breath catching slightly. "My daughter has been assaulted by another student. I believe it's a racially motivated attack. I want to report it as a hate crime." The line was quiet for a moment. "Sir, can you confirm your location again and the nature of the incident?" Michael's frustration bubbled up. Did he have to explain everything twice? "It's Westfield High School, and my daughter was attacked by a student. It's not the first time. This has been building for weeks. She's the only black girl in her class, and this boy, Ethan Miller, has been harassing her with racial slurs and threats. Today he pushed her, and she's injured." The dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, more concerned. "I understand, sir. We'll send officers to your location immediately. Are you and your daughter in a safe place?" Michael's eyes darted back to the bathroom door, where he could still see Zoe's figure through the small gap. "We're in the school, in the second-floor bathroom. But we're not leaving until the police get here. Help is on the way," the dispatcher assured him. "Stay with your daughter, and we'll send medical assistance as well." Michael ended the call, his fingers shaking slightly. He wanted to be with Zoe, but he also wanted answers. He wanted to know why the school hadn't done more to protect her. He wanted to know why the teachers, those who were supposed to watch over her, had allowed this to happen right under their noses. Miss Martinez, the school counselor, had been standing awkwardly near the bathroom door during his call. Now she approached him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Michael's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "My daughter has been tormented for weeks, and no one did anything. And now she's been assaulted. You think upset covers it?" Miss Martinez looked away, clearly flustered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. We've been handling the situation." "Handling it?" Michael's eyes blazed. "If you handled it, Zoe wouldn't be sitting in that bathroom right now, crying her eyes out, with a bruise on her face." "I understand," Miss Martinez began, but Michael wasn't interested in hearing more excuses. He'd had enough of the school's polite, diplomatic non-responses. His daughter had been suffering, and no one had lifted a finger to stop it. "What I don't understand," Michael said, his voice lowering but still hard, "is why no one did anything before now. This isn't new, is it? You said yourself that Ethan has been saying racist things for weeks. Why wasn't I informed?" Miss Martinez hesitated. We didn't want to escalate the situation." Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You didn't want to escalate the situation," he repeated, incredulous. "So you thought letting my daughter be harassed and bullied was better than addressing it?" Before Miss Martinez could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Michael turned to see Principal Harrison approaching, his face a mask of concern and authority. "Mr. Thompson," the principal greeted him in a tone that was meant to be calming but only fueled Michael's anger. "I heard about the situation with Zoe. I assure you, we're taking this very seriously." Michael stood up, his eyes narrowing at the principal. "It's about time someone took it seriously. Why wasn't I told about any of this? Why was my daughter left to fend for herself against a racist bully?" Principal Harrison held up a hand in a placating gesture. "Mr. Thompson, we try to handle these matters delicately. We've had conversations with Ethan. We've disciplined him in the past." Clearly, that discipline wasn't enough. Michael interrupted, his voice cold. "He attacked my daughter. He put his hands on her." Principal Harrison's face tightened, his calm veneer starting to crack. "We understand that this is a serious matter, but please, let us handle this internally. Calling the police will only escalate the situation." "I've already called them," Michael said flatly. "And this situation needs to be escalated. You had weeks to handle this internally, and you didn't. My daughter was assaulted because of her race. That's not something I'm going to let slide." For a moment, there was silence. Then the tension snapped as the faint sound of sirens reached their ears. The police were here. Principal Harrison's face darkened, clearly unhappy with the turn of events. "Mr. Thompson, I urge you to reconsider. Once the police are involved, this could affect Zoe's experience at school. It could cause more harm than good." "More harm than good." Michael's voice trembled with rage. "You think keeping this quiet would be better? You think letting this boy get away with hurting my daughter will make her life easier? I'm done listening to this nonsense." At that moment, Zoe emerged from the bathroom, her face tear-streaked but composed. Her eyes were puffy, but there was a look in them that Michael hadn't seen before, determination. She walked over to him slowly, wiping her cheeks as she stood beside him. "Dad," she said softly, "you don't have to do this." Michael looked down at her, his heart breaking at the sight of her trying to be strong. "Zoe, I'm doing this for you. I just want it to be over," she whispered, her voice filled with exhaustion. Michael knelt down so he was eye level with her, taking her hands in his. "I know you do, and I want that too. But if we don't stand up now, this won't end. It won't be over. It'll just keep happening, to you or to someone else. We need to make sure they take this seriously." Zoe stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if she was weighing his words. Finally, she nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Okay," she whispered. By now, the police had arrived. 2 officers, one male and one female, walked toward them, their expressions professional but empathetic. The female officer, Officer Riley, stepped forward first. She was a tall, imposing black woman with a calm demeanor that immediately set Michael at ease. "Mr. Thompson," she asked, glancing between Michael and Zoe, "I understand your daughter was assaulted. We'll need to take statements." Michael nodded. "Yes, she was. And I want this to be treated as a hate crime. This boy has been targeting her because of her race for weeks." Officer Riley looked directly at Zoe, her eyes softening. "Zoe, would you feel comfortable telling me what happened?" Zoe hesitated for a moment before nodding. She took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the day. How Ethan had cornered her in the hallway, how he pushed her against the lockers, how the other students had stood by, watching, doing nothing. As she spoke, Michael's anger deepened. How could no one have stepped in? How could the teachers have turned a blind eye to this? When Zoe finished, Officer Riley nodded and made a few notes. "Thank you, Zoe. I know that wasn't easy." Zoe wiped her eyes again, her voice steady but quiet. "I just wanted to stop." Officer Riley glanced at Michael. "We'll speak to the school administration and the other students involved. If what Zoe says checks out, we'll open an investigation into the harassment." "Thank you," Michael said, his voice tight. He knew this was just the beginning. There would be meetings, statements, investigations, but he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He couldn't let this continue. Not for Zoe, not for any other child who might be going through the same thing. As the officers went to speak with Principal Harrison, Michael stood beside Zoe, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, her body still trembling slightly, but there was something in her eyes now, something stronger. "Dad?" Zoe whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you didn't let them ignore it this time," she said quietly. Michael's heart swelled. "I'll never let them ignore you, Zoe. Never again." The fight wasn't over. Michael knew that. In fact, it was just beginning. But as he stood there with his daughter, he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect her, to make sure she never had to face this kind of hate alone again. And no matter how long it took, he would see this through to the end. The fight for justice. The drive home from Westfield High School was shrouded in an uncomfortable silence. Zoe sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed out the window as the town sped by in a blur. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he struggled to process everything that had happened. His mind was racing with questions. What had he missed? How had he not noticed the depth of Zoe's pain earlier? And more importantly, what was going to happen next? As they pulled into the driveway of their modest 2-story house, Michael stole a glance at his daughter. Zoe hadn't said much since they left the school, and the silence between them felt heavy, laden with emotions neither of them quite knew how to express. "You hungry?" Michael asked softly, trying to ease the tension. Zoe shook her head, not meeting his eyes. Her usually vibrant face was dull, and her hands were clenched in her lap. Michael sighed and reached over, gently resting his hand on hers. "Zoe, I'm so sorry. I should have known something was wrong. I should have done more." Zoe finally turned to him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and something deeper, something that tugged at Michael's heart. "It's not your fault, Dad," she whispered. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think you could fix it. I didn't think anyone could." The admission hit Michael hard. His heart ached for Zoe, but it also sparked something inside him. A burning desire to make things right, no matter what. He couldn't undo the pain Zoe had endured, but he could make sure she never had to face it alone again. He nodded slowly, his voice resolute. "We're going to fix this. I don't care how long it takes or what we have to do, but we're not letting them get away with this. Not Ethan. Not the school. No one." Zoe's eyes softened, and she leaned her head against the window, too tired to argue. Michael hated that she had been put in this position, forced to grow up too fast, burdened with the weight of racism and cruelty at such a young age. But he also admired her resilience. Zoe had fought for herself, even when it felt like no one else would. And now Michael would fight for her. As they entered the house, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call from the school district office, no doubt wanting to address the police involvement. He ignored it. There would be time to talk with the district, but right now his focus was on Zoe. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" Michael suggested as Zoe trudged upstairs to her room. She nodded silently, disappearing behind her door, leaving Michael standing alone in the hallway. The anger simmering beneath his skin hadn't cooled since the confrontation with Principal Harrison. He knew this wasn't just about Ethan Miller. It was about a system that had failed Zoe, a system that had allowed racist behavior to go unchecked, that had turned a blind eye to the bullying and the racial slurs. And if he didn't act now, it wouldn't stop. Michael sank down into the worn living room couch, his mind already formulating a plan. He would need to meet with a lawyer, someone who understood civil rights cases and could help him take legal action against the school for its negligence. He wouldn't rest until the people responsible were held accountable. But before that, he needed to talk to someone who understood what it was like to raise a black child in a world that didn't always welcome them. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, finally landing on the number he was looking for, Deborah. Deborah Jackson was a family friend and a local activist who had worked with transracial adoptive families for years. She had been a mentor to Michael ever since he and Sarah had adopted Zoe, offering guidance and support when they faced challenges. If anyone could help him navigate this, it was Deborah. He pressed the call button, and after a few rings, her familiar voice filled the line. "Michael, what's going on?" Michael took a deep breath. "Deborah, it's Zoe. Something happened at school today." He recounted the events of the day, the harassment, the assault, the school's response, or lack thereof. By the time he finished, Deborah was silent for a long moment. "Michael, I'm so sorry," she said finally, her voice filled with empathy. "But I'm not surprised. Schools like Westfield, they talk a good game about diversity, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to confront the hard realities. They'd rather sweep this kind of thing under the rug and protect their reputation." Michael's jaw clenched. "That's exactly what they're trying to do. Principal Harrison all but told me to drop it, that handling it internally would be better. But Zoe, she's been suffering, and if I hadn't gone to the school today, who knows how much longer this would have gone on." "Good for you for standing up for her," Deborah said firmly. "But you're right. It's bigger than just Zoe and Ethan. It's systemic. The school didn't protect her, and that's on them. You need to make them answer for it." "That's what I'm going to do," Michael replied, his voice hardening with determination. "I'm going to contact a lawyer. I want to file a formal complaint against the school. I'm done with their excuses." "Good," Deborah said approvingly. "And I can recommend a lawyer who specializes in civil rights cases. You need someone who knows how to take on a school district and win." Michael scribbled down the name Deborah gave him. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," Deborah replied warmly. "But I'm here for you, Michael. For you and Zoe. Whatever you need, just say the word." After hanging up, Michael leaned back against the couch, feeling a small sense of relief that he now had a plan. He would contact the lawyer first thing in the morning. But for now, he needed to check on Zoe. Climbing the stairs, he paused outside her room, hesitating for a moment before knocking gently. "Zoe, can I come in?" "Yeah," came her quiet response. Michael opened the door to find Zoe lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She looked so small, so fragile, that it made his heart ache. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "How are you feeling?" Zoe shrugged, not taking her eyes off the ceiling. "I don't know," she whispered. "I feel tired." Michael nodded, understanding. "I know. It's a lot. But you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here. And we're going to make sure this never happens again." Zoe finally looked at him, her brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if it doesn't work, Dad? What if nothing changes?" Michael took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Things will change," he said firmly. "It might take time, and it might be hard, but we're going to fight for it. And we're not just fighting for you. We're fighting for every kid who's ever been made to feel less because of who they are." Zoe bit her lip, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want to be normal," she whispered. "I don't want people to hate me because I'm different." Michael's heart shattered at her words. He wished he could take away her pain, wished he could protect her from the ugliness of the world, but he knew he couldn't shield her from everything. "You are normal, Zoe," he said gently. "You're perfect just the way you are, and anyone who makes you feel like you don't belong, that's their problem, not yours." Zoe didn't say anything for a long moment, her eyes distant as she processed his words. Finally, she nodded slightly, her lip trembling. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. Michael leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Get some rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow, we start the fight." As he left her room and closed the door behind him, Michael felt the weight of what lay ahead. He wasn't just fighting for Zoe. He was fighting for every child who had been ignored, every student who had been made to feel small, powerless, and unworthy. And he wasn't going to stop until the school system was forced to confront the truth. That night, Michael barely slept. His mind raced with the details of what he needed to do: meet with the lawyer, gather evidence, talk to other parents, and prepare for what would undoubtedly be a long and grueling battle. By morning, he was more determined than ever. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, as he drafted an email to the lawyer Deborah had recommended. The email was clear and concise, outlining the events leading up to the assault and detailing the school's failure to address the racist harassment Zoe had endured. He hit send, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. A fight was coming, but Michael was ready. He had to be. For Zoe, for the other kids, for justice. As the day wore on, Michael's phone rang. It was the school district's superintendent, calling to discuss the incident. Michael had expected this. They wanted to contain the situation, to prevent any more bad publicity. But Michael was done with playing nice. "Mr. Thompson," the superintendent's voice was calm, measured. "I understand that emotions are running high, but I want to assure you that we take all incidents of this nature very seriously." Michael's jaw clenched. Then why wasn't I informed about the harassment Zoe was facing weeks ago? Why did it have to escalate to physical violence before anyone took notice? There was a pause on the other end of the line. We were handling the situation as it developed. We didn't want to overreact. Michael's temper flared. Overreact? My daughter was pushed into a locker because of her race. This isn't overreacting. This is me protecting my child when you fail to. The superintendent sighed. "We'd like to meet with you, Mr. Thompson, to discuss how we can move forward." Michael knew what that meant. They wanted to make the problem go away quietly, but Michael wasn't going to let them. "I'll meet with you," Michael said, his voice cold. "But understand this, I'm not dropping this. The police are involved now, and so is my lawyer. We're going to expose this for what it is, systemic negligence. And I'm not stopping until things change." The superintendent's tone shifted slightly, more guarded. "We'll be in touch." As Michael ended the call, He felt a surge of resolve. This was bigger than Zoe. This was about holding the entire system accountable. And as far as he was concerned, the fight was just getting started. Michael would do whatever it took to protect his daughter and ensure that no other child had to suffer the way Zoe had. The road ahead was long, and it wouldn't be easy, but Michael had made a vow. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The battle begins. The morning of Michael's meeting with the school board felt like the calm before a storm. The weight of the impending confrontation settled on his shoulders like a physical burden as he prepared to take on a system he knew would resist every step of the way. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his face looking more haggard than usual. The sleepless nights, the emotional toll, and the constant swirl of anger and frustration were starting to show. But he couldn't afford to falter now, not when Zoe's future, and the future of so many other kids like her, hung in the balance. Downstairs, Zoe sat quietly at the kitchen table, poking at her cereal. She barely touched it, and Michael could see the strain on her face. The events of the past week had taken their toll on her too. She had been quieter, more withdrawn, and though Michael wanted nothing more than to take all this pain away from her, he knew that was impossible. The only thing he could do now was fight for her. Zoe, Michael began softly, sitting across from her. Today's the meeting with the school board. I know it might seem like nothing's going to change, but I want you to know, I won't stop fighting for you. Zoe looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What if they don't listen, Dad? What if they just make excuses like they always do? Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Then we make them listen. We're not backing down. Not this time. Zoe nodded, but the weariness in her eyes didn't fade. I'm scared, Dad, she admitted quietly. I'm scared that nothing will change, and I'll have to go back to school and see Ethan and all the kids who stood by and did nothing. I don't know if I can face them. Michael's heart ached at her words. He squeezed her hand, wishing he could offer her a world where she didn't have to be brave all the time. But he couldn't lie to her, not now. I know you're scared, sweetheart, and it's okay to be. But I promise you, you're not alone. You have me. You have Deborah. And you have so many people standing behind you who want to see justice done. Zoe didn't say anything for a moment, her gaze distant, as if she were trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening. I just want to feel safe, she whispered. Michael felt a surge of determination rise in his chest. That's what I'm going to make sure of. You will feel safe again, Zoe. I won't stop until you do. The meeting with the school board was scheduled for that afternoon, but Michael wasn't going into it alone. Deborah had agreed to join him, along with the lawyer she'd recommended, Jasmine Harris, a fierce civil rights attorney who had taken on cases like this before. She was young, sharp, and didn't back down from a fight, which was exactly what Michael needed. When they arrived at the school district office, the tension was palpable. Michael felt it in the way the receptionist avoided eye contact, in the way the district employees shuffled papers nervously as he walked by. They knew this was more than just a routine disciplinary matter. This was a fight for accountability, and Michael had come armed. As they entered the boardroom, Michael's gaze swept the room. Principal Harrison was there, along with Superintendent Harris, several members of the school board, and a few other district officials. They all wore carefully composed expressions, but Michael could see the nervousness behind their eyes. They knew the gravity of the situation, and they were hoping to contain it. Jasmine took a seat beside Michael, setting down a thick folder of documents in front of her. Deborah sat on his other side, her presence a quiet but steady source of strength. Zoe wasn't there. Michael had insisted she stay home, not wanting to subject her to the stress of the meeting. He would carry this burden for her. Mr. Thompson, Superintendent Harris greeted him, forcing a polite smile. We understand that there's been a difficult situation involving your daughter. We want to work together to find a resolution that's in everyone's best interest. Michael's jaw tightened. Best interest. He knew what that meant. finding a way to smooth things over without actually addressing the root of the problem. "I'm not here for a polite discussion," Michael said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm here because my daughter has been the victim of racist harassment and assault, and the school did nothing to stop it. In fact, they allowed it to continue for weeks." Principal Harrison cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but we have protocols in place to address incidents of bullying and harassment. Ethan Miller has been disciplined in the past for inappropriate behavior, but we felt that." Michael cut him off, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Disciplining him wasn't enough, was it? He put his hands on my daughter. He assaulted her. That's not something you can brush off as inappropriate behavior. This is a hate crime." Superintendent Harris interjected, her tone still maddeningly diplomatic. "Mr. Thompson, we take all allegations of harassment seriously. However, labeling this incident as a hate crime is—" "It is a hate crime," Jasmine said, her voice sharp and cutting through the room like a knife. "And we intend to pursue legal action on that basis. What happened to Zoe wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the culmination of weeks of racially motivated harassment that the school failed to address. That's negligence, and it's unacceptable." The room fell silent as Jasmine's words hung in the air. The school board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. They hadn't expected this level of resistance. Superintendent Harris's polite facade began to crack. "We want to resolve this matter without further escalation," she said carefully. "We understand that this is an emotional issue, but involving the courts is exactly what's going to happen if you don't take this seriously." Jasmine interrupted. "My client has been more than patient with your protocols and your internal handling of the situation. But let's be clear, those protocols failed. You failed Zoe, and you failed to provide her with a safe environment. Now we're giving you a chance to correct that mistake, or we'll take this to court." Michael watched as the members of the school board exchanged uneasy looks. They were clearly not used to being challenged like this, especially not so publicly. He could feel the power dynamics in the room shifting as Jasmine pressed on, outlining the specific instances of harassment Zoe had faced and the school's failure to act. Every word was like a weight pressing down on the board, making it impossible for them to dismiss the severity of the situation. Principal Harrison tried to interject again, his voice tight with frustration. "Mr. Thompson, we're not disputing that what happened to Zoe was wrong. Ethan Miller's behavior was unacceptable, and he's been suspended pending further disciplinary action. But we're asking that you give us a chance to handle this internally. Bringing in the police and filing a lawsuit will only escalate tensions at the school, and it could have long-term consequences for Zoe and other students." Michael felt a surge of anger. This was exactly what they wanted: quiet compliance, sweeping the issue under the rug to protect their reputation. But Michael had already made up his mind. "I didn't come here to negotiate," Michael said, his voice steady and resolute. "I came here to demand change. My daughter deserves to go to school without being harassed because of the color of her skin, and she deserves to know that if something happens to her, the people in charge will protect her. So far, you've done neither." Jasmine nodded in agreement, her tone icy but professional. "We're not here to negotiate either. We're here to make sure this district takes accountability for its failures. And if you refuse to do that, we'll be forced to pursue legal action." Superintendent Harris's calm exterior was beginning to fray. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "Mr. Thompson, we don't want this to turn into a drawn-out legal battle. We're willing to work with you to address the situation, but you need to understand that there are limits to what we can do." Michael stood up, his heart pounding. "Then maybe it's time you reevaluate those limits." The silence in the room was deafening. Michael could see the weight of his words sinking in. The board members were beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be a simple issue they could sweep away. This was bigger than a single incident. This was about systemic failure, about the school's inability to protect its most vulnerable students. Superintendent Harris finally spoke again, her voice strained. "We'll review the policies regarding racial harassment and make recommendations to strengthen them. But I need you to understand that change doesn't happen overnight." Michael leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I'm not asking for overnight. I'm asking for now." The meeting ended shortly after, with the school board promising to review their policies and conduct a full investigation into the incident. But Michael knew this was only the first battle. The school board's promises felt hollow, and he knew they were more concerned with damage control than real change. As they left the district office, Jasmine turned to him, her expression unreadable. "They're scared," she said. "That's good. But this is going to be a long fight. Are you ready for that?" Michael nodded, his gaze unwavering. "For Zoe, I'm ready for whatever comes." Jasmine gave him a small, approving nod. "Good. We'll hit them where it hurts, in the media and in court. They'll have to make changes if they want to avoid a lawsuit. But we need to stay vigilant. They'll try to downplay this." Michael's mind was racing as they made their way to the car. He thought about Zoe, about the pain she had endured, and about the other kids who might be going through the same thing, but had no one to stand up for them. The battle was far from over, but Michael felt a sense of clarity. He had always been willing to fight for his daughter, but now he realized he was fighting for something even bigger, for justice, for accountability, and for a future where Zoe and kids like her wouldn't have to live in fear. As they drove home, Michael glanced at his phone, seeing a message from Zoe. "Thanks, Dad. I love you." A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't walking it alone. And for Zoe, he'd walk it until the very end. Rallying the community. The tension in the Thompson household had reached a fever pitch in the days following the meeting with the school board. Michael had done everything in his power to remain calm and collected, but beneath the surface, his frustration simmered. The school's promise to review their policies felt like nothing more than a half-hearted attempt to placate him, and the lack of immediate action weighed heavily on his mind. Zoe had returned to school, but every day Michael sent her off, his heart clenched with fear. What if Ethan was still there, lurking in the hallways, his punishment delayed by bureaucratic red tape? What if other students saw Zoe as a target now that the incident had become public? He couldn't shake the feeling that the school wasn't doing enough, that they were waiting for the dust to settle so they could sweep the problem under the rug. It wasn't until the weekend rolled around that Michael began to think beyond just the school board. He had been reactive up until this point, responding to each injustice as it came, but now he realized that he needed to take the fight to the next level. This wasn't just about the administration. This was about the entire community. He sat at the kitchen table that Saturday morning, staring at the news article on his laptop. The headline read, "Local School Under Fire for Alleged Racist Assault." His stomach twisted at the sight of Zoe's name in print, the accompanying article recounting the details of the incident, along with a few tepid statements from the school district about their ongoing investigation. There was nothing about systemic change, nothing about new policies, nothing concrete. As he scrolled through the comments section, a knot formed in his stomach. The backlash was worse than he'd expected. While many expressed sympathy for Zoe and demanded justice, there was an undercurrent of hostility that chilled Michael to the bone. This is just another case of someone blowing things out of proportion. Kids fight all the time. Why make it about race? The dad is just looking for attention. Michael slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking. How could people be so blind? How could they ignore the fact that this wasn't just a kid's fight? This was about racism, about a pattern of behavior that the school had ignored for far too long. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He needed to think clearly. He needed to be strategic. He couldn't afford to get swept up in anger and emotion, even though every fiber of his being was screaming to shout down the ignorance and hate that surrounded him. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind. The school board had its limits. They were tied up in bureaucracy, in politics, in protecting their reputation. But the community, that was something he could influence. If he could rally enough people behind him, if he could make this a movement, then the school would have no choice but to listen. They couldn't ignore an entire town demanding change. Michael pulled out his phone and called Deborah. She answered on the second ring. "Michael," she said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "How are you holding up?" "Deborah," Michael began, his voice steady but firm. "I need your help. I'm done waiting for the school to act. It's time to get the community involved." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Deborah's voice filled with approval. "I've been waiting for you to say that." They spent the next hour discussing strategy, brainstorming ways to bring people together. Deborah, with her years of experience as an activist, had an innate understanding of how to build a movement. She suggested organizing a town hall meeting, inviting parents, students, and community members to come and speak about their experiences with racism in the school system. It couldn't just be about Zoe. This had to be bigger than her story. They needed to expose the systemic problems that had allowed this to happen in the first place. "Once we have enough voices behind us," Deborah said, "we'll have the power to demand real change. The school won't be able to ignore us, and neither will the rest of the town." Michael felt a surge of hope at her words. This was the way forward. He'd been fighting alone for too long, but now, with the community behind him, they could finally make the school district listen. Over the next few days, Michael and Deborah worked tirelessly to organize the event. They secured a local church hall as the venue, reached out to community leaders, and posted flyers around town, inviting anyone who had experienced or witnessed racial discrimination to come and share their stories. The night of the town hall arrived, and Michael stood nervously at the front of the room, scanning the growing crowd. Rows of folding chairs had been set up, and slowly but surely, people were filling them. Some were parents, others were students. There were a few familiar faces, Zoe's teachers, neighbors, and friends from school. But there were also faces Michael didn't recognize, people from outside his immediate circle who had come because they wanted to be heard. Zoe sat in the front row with Deborah by her side, her face tense with anticipation. Michael knew this was hard for her, to see her story laid bare in front of the entire town. But she had been resolute. She wanted to be there. She wanted to see the change she had been fighting for. When it was time to begin, Michael stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spoken in front of crowds before, but never like this, never with so much at stake. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "I know this isn't an easy topic to discuss, but it's one we can't ignore any longer. My daughter, Zoe, was assaulted at school because of her race. But this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of racism and discrimination that has been allowed to fester in our schools and in our community for far too long." He paused, glancing at Zoe. She gave him a small nod, encouraging him to continue. "When Zoe told me what she had been going through, the racial slurs, the bullying, the harassment, I realized that the system had failed her. The school didn't protect her. They didn't protect the other kids who have faced the same kind of treatment. And they won't protect the next kid unless we make them." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Michael could see the pain in the eyes of some of the parents, the tension in the students who sat quietly, their arms crossed tightly over their chests. They knew this wasn't just about Zoe. They knew this was about all of them. So tonight, we're here to share our stories. We're here to let the school district know that we won't stay silent any longer. We're demanding change, and we won't stop until we get it. He stepped back from the podium, giving the floor to Deborah, who introduced the first speaker. One by one, people came up to share their experiences. A black mother recounted how her son had been called racial slurs by classmates, and when she reported it to the school, they told her it was just kids being kids. A Latina student shared how she had been overlooked for academic opportunities because of her background. An Asian American father spoke of how his daughter had been mocked for her accent, and how the school had done nothing to address it. The stories poured out, each one a testament to the deep-rooted problems that ran through the school system. Michael watched as the crowd listened, their faces shifting from shock to anger to determination. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The community was waking up to the reality of what was happening, and they were ready to fight back. Zoe sat quietly through it all, her hands folded in her lap. Michael knew this must be hard for her, to hear so many other people's pain echoing her own. But he also knew that she needed to see this. She needed to know that she wasn't alone. As the night drew to a close, Deborah returned to the podium, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We've heard a lot of pain tonight," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "But we've also heard a lot of hope, hope that things can change. And I want you all to know that we're going to keep fighting. We're going to take these stories, and we're going to bring them to the school board, to the media, to anyone who will listen. We won't stop until we see real change." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of energy sweeping through the room. Michael felt a swell of pride. This was the start of something bigger than he had ever imagined. The community was behind him, behind Zoe, and they were ready to take on the school district. As the crowd began to disperse, Michael caught sight of a figure lingering at the back of the room. It was Ethan Miller's father, David. Michael hadn't seen him since the incident, and the sight of him sent a ripple of unease through his chest. David's face was tight, his expression unreadable as he watched the last of the crowd filter out. Michael hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. He wasn't sure what to expect: anger, defensiveness, or maybe even more denial of what had happened. But as he approached, David met his eyes, and to Michael's surprise, there was no hostility in his gaze, just something that looked like remorse. "Mr. Thompson," David began, his voice low and measured, "I came here tonight because I wanted to understand. I wanted to hear what you and your daughter have been through." Michael studied him for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had spent weeks battling his anger toward Ethan and his family. But now, standing in front of David, he saw something different. Another father who was grappling with the consequences of his son's actions. David's shoulders sagged slightly as he continued, "I don't condone what Ethan did. It was wrong. And I've told him that over and over. But I also didn't realize how deep this goes. Listening to these stories tonight, it opened my eyes to a lot of things I didn't want to see." Michael's anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, began to cool. He could see the genuine guilt in David's expression, the weight of a father who had failed to protect his own child from falling into the trap of hate. "I appreciate that," Michael said quietly. "But words won't fix this. It's going to take action. From all of us." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I want to help. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. For Ethan, and for the other kids." Michael gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. The fight ahead was still long, and there would be many more battles to come. But for the first time in weeks, Michael felt like they were moving in the right direction. As he left the church hall with Zoe by his side, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had rallied the community. They had shared their stories, and now they were stronger for it. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't fighting alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like they were going to win. The road to victory. The aftermath of the town hall was immediate and powerful. Word spread quickly across Brookridge and the neighboring towns. The local paper covered the event, but it wasn't long before national news outlets picked up the story. Suddenly, Westfield High School was at the center of a national conversation about racism in schools, and Zoe's story was no longer just a local issue. It had become part of a much larger narrative about systemic injustice, racial discrimination, and the need for change. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt like they were gaining real momentum. The stories shared at the town hall had resonated deeply with the community, and more people began coming forward. Students, parents, and even former teachers who had witnessed or experienced discrimination, but had remained silent out of fear. Now, it seemed, that silence was breaking. Despite the surge of support, the school district wasn't going down without a fight. Within days of the town hall, the superintendent issued a statement to the press, insisting that the district had zero tolerance for racism and that they were fully committed to investigating the incident involving Zoe. But the statement rang hollow to Michael and many others in the community. It was filled with the same vague promises and deflections that had been used to avoid accountability in the past. The school board called an emergency meeting to address the growing outcry, and this time, Michael and Jasmine knew they needed to be prepared. The meeting would be public, and the board would likely try to control the narrative, presenting themselves as responsive and proactive. But Michael had a plan to make sure they wouldn't be able to get away with more empty promises. On the day of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. Parents, students, community members, and media outlets filled every seat, the tension in the air palpable. Zoe sat beside Michael in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been quieter than usual over the past few days, but Michael knew she was processing everything that was happening. This fight had thrust her into the spotlight in ways neither of them had anticipated, and though Michael wished he could shield her from the scrutiny, he knew she wanted to be here. She wanted to see this through. Jasmine had come armed with evidence, emails, statements, and documented instances of discrimination within the school that had gone unaddressed for far too long. But more importantly, Michael had something the school board couldn't dismiss: the voices of the community. As the board members filed into the room, their expressions ranged from tense to neutral, but it was clear that they understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Zoe anymore. It was about the integrity of the entire school district and their ability to protect their students. Superintendent Harris opened the meeting with a carefully worded statement about the district's commitment to creating a safe and inclusive environment for all students. But Michael could see through the facade. The district was more interested in damage control than in making real changes. When the floor was open for public comment, Jasmine was the first to speak, her voice clear and commanding as she laid out the case against the district. She highlighted the specific instances of harassment Zoe had faced, the school's failure to act, and the broader culture of neglect that had allowed racism to go unchecked. Her presentation was precise and devastating, painting a picture of a system that had failed not just Zoe, but countless other students as well. But it was when Michael took the podium that the room seemed to truly shift. He hadn't planned out his speech in advance. He had been too caught up in the whirlwind of events to sit down and write it out. But as he stood before the school board, the words seemed to come to him effortlessly, fueled by weeks of frustration, pain, and a fierce determination to see justice done. "My daughter, Zoe, deserves better," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She deserves to go to school without fear of being harassed or assaulted because of the color of her skin. Every child in this district deserves that. But that's not the reality we're living in. The reality is that this school and this district failed her. They failed to protect her, and they failed to take action when she came forward." Michael paused, scanning the faces of the board members, looking for some sign of recognition, of understanding. But their expressions remained carefully neutral. "I know that some of you may think this is an isolated incident," he continued, "that it's just one student, one mistake. But it's not. We've heard story after story from other students, other parents, about the racism that's been allowed to fester in this school for years. It's not just about one incident. It's about a system that's broken." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Michael could feel the energy in the room shift. People were listening. They were ready for change. "I'm not here to ask for apologies," Michael said, his voice hardening. "I'm here to demand accountability. I'm here to demand that this school and this district take real, meaningful steps to address the racism that's been allowed to thrive. We need new policies, new training, and new leadership if necessary. Because this can't happen again. Not to my daughter. Not to anyone else." When Michael finished, the room erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, his heart racing, and sat back down next to Zoe. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with pride. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. Michael squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you too, Zoe." The rest of the meeting was a blur of comments, rebuttals, and statements from community members. The voices that had been silenced for so long were finally being heard, and the school board could no longer ignore them. By the end of the night, the board was visibly shaken. They had been expecting a fight, but not one of this magnitude. Jasmine had presented a list of demands, including a comprehensive review of the district's policies on racial harassment, mandatory sensitivity training for staff and students, and a formal apology to Zoe and the other students who had been harmed by the district's inaction. It was clear that the board wasn't prepared to agree to all of the demands on the spot, but they couldn't deny the pressure they were under. They promised to review the demands and to hold another meeting within the week to announce their decisions. As Michael, Zoe, and Jasmine left the auditorium that night, the air was buzzing with anticipation. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken a huge step forward. The school board had been forced to confront the truth, and they could no longer pretend that everything was fine. In the days that followed, Michael kept a close eye on the news coverage. The media had latched onto the story, framing it as a national debate about racism in schools. It wasn't just local anymore. People across the country were watching, waiting to see how the district would respond. The pressure was mounting, and Michael knew that the school board would have no choice but to act. The following week, the school board reconvened for a final vote on the demands. The auditorium was packed again, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Zoe sat beside Michael, her hand gripping his tightly. She had been through so much, and though Michael knew she was strong, he couldn't help but worry about the toll this fight had taken on her. Superintendent Harris was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled as she announced the board's decision. After days of deliberation, the board had agreed to several of Jasmine's key demands. They would implement mandatory anti-racism training for staff and students, revise their policies on harassment and discrimination, and issue a formal apology to the students who had been harmed. But there was one more thing. Superintendent Harris paused, her eyes sweeping the room before she continued. "We have also made the difficult decision to accept the resignation of Principal Harrison, effective immediately," she announced. "We believe that new leadership is necessary to ensure that these changes are implemented fully and effectively." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was more than he had expected. The board had not only agreed to the demands, but had taken real concrete steps to address the systemic issues that had allowed racism to thrive. As the meeting concluded, Michael turned to Zoe, his heart swelling with pride. They had done it. They had fought back, and they had won. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. The school district made good on its promises, rolling out new policies, new training, and new leadership. The culture at Westfield High began to shift, slowly but surely, as students and staff were held to higher standards of accountability. There were setbacks, of course. Change was never easy, but the community had rallied behind Zoe and the other students, demanding better for their children. Zoe, for her part, found a new sense of strength and purpose. The fight had been exhausting, but it had also awakened something in her, a determination to continue standing up for what was right, not just for herself, but for others. She joined a student-led group focused on racial justice, using her experience to advocate for change at the school and beyond. One evening, months after the final board meeting, Michael and Zoe sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The warm hues of orange and pink bathed the sky, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a sense of peace. "You did it, Dad," Zoe said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "You really did it." Michael smiled, looking over at his daughter. She had grown so much through this ordeal, and though he wished she hadn't had to endure such pain, he was in awe of the strength she had found within herself. "No, Zoe," he said gently. We did it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past year lifting, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. The road ahead was still long. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight. But for now, they could rest in the knowledge that they had made a difference. For Michael, the fight had been personal from the beginning, a father's desperate need to protect his daughter from a world that had tried to diminish her. But in the end, it had become something much bigger. It had become a fight for justice, for accountability, and for a future where no child would have to face what Zoe had faced. And though the battle had been long and difficult, it had been worth it. Because in the end, they had won.